At the end of the symposium, we'll have a short discussion where we will talk about how we can apply this to our area. So we encourage folks to type up. There will be opportunities for questions at the end of each presentation. And other than that, just want to we're just very grateful for our presenters. They're coming from all over to give us some good information. So thankful for them taking the time today and also to prepare for this presentation. We really appreciate that. So with that, Dr. Jon, are you ready?
Okay, well, we're just going to go through some work we've done up here around burns with Western Juniper management over the last, well, I guess I got started on this back in the early 90s with Rick Miller. He was my major professor. Let's see. There we go. Okay. So my colleague on a lot of these studies has been Kirk Davies. I'm sure people have heard of him. He's been helping me out on this stuff since 1999 when he first started working for me. A little bit of background on Western Juniper, for anyone who's not familiar. This is kind of old data. This is from probably 20 years ago, but the estimate was 8.5 million acres of Western Juniper across about 4 states. And most of these woodlands are young. 95% of the woodlands are less than, well, now this is an old slide too. So less than about 140 years old to 160 years old. The reason for the expansion was pretty much lack of fire. You can see this is a graph from one of Rick Miller's studies that was down on the Ochoa near Summer Lake. And it shows the fire events were pretty common for about 200 years on this one area. And then right around settlement, the fires stopped in this area. And you can see the juniper expansion that occurred after that. So that's pretty common wherever we're working with Western juniper. Now, the topics today I was going to go over were some juniper treatments, looking at mechanical prescribed fire, some fuels management, and then a little thing on herbicide. That wasn't a study we did. That was done up in the Monument Soil Water Conservation District. And then some recovery response in a composition, forage production, a little bit on hydrology and some benefits and problems with all those treatments. So the parameters behind this talk today are, we're looking at pre-treatment vegetation is native dominated. So if you have an understory dominated by invasives, you got an invasive problem, not a woodland. Well, you may have a woodland problem, but your invasive problem is the biggest one. So that has to be considered first before you take any trees out, I think. And the tree species and plant associations we're going to be focusing on are, of course, Western juniper, and then mountain, Wyoming, and basin big sagebrush, as well as we have done some aspen work as well. Low sage, it does come into low sage, but a lot of those areas are more tablelands than anything. So juniper is supposed to be there. A lot of old trees usually in those areas. And looking at woodland treatments, understanding what phase you're in is important. So early succession or phase 1, those are pretty easy to treat. Fire, of course, and mechanical, but fire's probably the easiest way to get rid of those trees. Phase 2, where there's a kind of a co-dominance with the understory shrubs and juniper, and then as you move into phase 3, you may have a phase 3 that has a pretty good understory, but the shrubs have been taken out. Those are usually on deeper soils. And then on shallower soils with a restrictive layer, the juniper can really not only take out the shrubs, but really reduces herbaceous. So you have a lot more bare ground. And that's where you generally have your hydraulic problems with erosion and runoff. So for mechanical control, I've done a little work with the heavy equipment, mostly chainsaws that we use up here. Um, some of the we have done a little bit work with some of the grinders. The Nature Conservancy over in Idaho does a real nice job with that on some of their early woodland, and to the point where you can't really see that the treatment's been done after a year or two. Um, for mechanical control, in terms of this is a chainsaw treatment we did on Squaw Butte um, on a phase 2 woodland, but it applies to phase 1 woodlands as well. So you can see a recovery of herbaceous cover within the next year or two. Production only takes it might recover the first year. Also, might take up to 3 years depending on how late a phase two woodland it is. Shrub recovery is highly variable, but generally you have pretty good shrub component already on the site, so it usually isn't a concern with shrubs not having trouble coming back in. And in terms of composition, of course, that's all site selection. That's why I get back to looking at what your understory is. If you have a pretty good understory, you're probably going to get a pretty good response. But if you have a lot of annuals in the site, you're going to have an annual increase for sure. Whether the perennials can come in and slowly push out those annuals is debatable. It depends on a lot on the elevation aspect and what precip zone you're on. Usually, if you're up above 14 inches precip in our area, the natives are pretty competitive with the annuals. And for phase 3 woodlands, that varies a lot depending on what kind of understory you have. If you have a pretty good understory to begin with, those are those deeper soil sites, it recovers very quickly within a year or two. But if you're on those more restrictive horizons, it may take up to 10 years to recover your cover and production potentials, because it still has to fill in with new plants. And that does, and you're looking at, say, for on this juniper treatment here, it took about 2 years for decent seed production to be produced by the natives around the site. And then another couple of years before you start seeing really good establishment. So you're looking at 5 years before you start seeing a really big change on the area in terms of recruitment. And then it takes time for those plants to grow as well. So you're up to 10 years in some cases on these areas. And production, same thing, 3 to 10 years to get back up to that site potential. Shrub recovery on these areas also depends on, of course, your pre-treatment characteristics. If you don't have many shrubs left in the area, it does take longer. On one site we had on Steens Mountain there, it was a shallow soil and southern exposure, and that took, we'll put it this way, the shrub cover is coming back, but the juniper is coming back almost as fast. So I don't think we'll ever hit site potential for that area with the shrubs. And for fuel treatments, we've done a lot of studies on these on fuel treatments. When you look at any kind of mechanical treatment, if it's just laying the trees on the ground, you can develop a very high fuel load. So say if a phase 3 or a phase 1, a phase 2 or mid-succession area, 3 to 15 tons per acre. And on a later succession site, you might get up to 15 to 35 tons per acre. So that's a real fuel hazard that has to be dealt with. And there's a couple ways to do it. What they've done up here, what we've done on some of our work on Squaw Butte, has been either broadcast fire after first fall rains and also spring broadcast fires. Those tend to burn a little hot, so you're going to get higher mortality with the understory that you have in there. Pile burning, that's just cutting the trees and having them piled, and then they're burned usually after the first snows in the spring. I mean, in the fall or early spring burning. And I'll go a little more detail into the pile burning treatments we've done up here. And then jackpot, that's just going around and burning individual trees in place that have been felled. So we usually do that late fall to early spring. And of course, there is mastication. You can masticate the trees as well, but that's not as common up here as some other areas where Western juniper is being treated. So broadcast versus jackpot burning. We've done a couple work studies on this, and the broadcast does a good job at reducing your fuel load in terms of getting rid of a lot more of the wood. Jackpot burning mostly burns off all the flashy stuff, and so you don't have as much heat going into the soil, so your understory tends to stay in a lot better shape than the broadcast fire. So if you do burn these areas in September, October, or April or May, it's equivalent to a high severity fire where those trees are burned in place. So you can see the soil surface and soil surface 1 inch and 1 inch deep into the soil. You can see how hot it can get. And so your fuel consumption is up to, your 100,000 hour fuels. And so that pretty much takes out whatever native understory you've got where those trees have been felled or around the stumps. With the low severity fire, where we tend to burn those areas when soils are at field capacity and frozen, and there's really no heat flux into the soil that's detectable. And fuel consumption, you're only burning off all the flashy stuff. So you really don't kill any of your natives underneath the trees. And this is the photograph there on the bottom. There is an area that was burned probably a year and a half. Probably the second growing season on that site. And this is a comparison between winter burns versus a September broadcast burn. And the data here shows with the stump and cut areas, you can see how the cheatgrass in that September, October burns a lot higher where the trees have been cut and burned in September versus the winter burn where you're pretty much dominated. You're dominated by the native perennials. And then in comparison, the interspaces usually aren't really affected by those burning in place treatments or broadcast fire. They come back just fine. So pile burning, we did a study up north of Burns where the junipers were pretty thick, 35 to 45% cover. And the trees were all chainsaw cut and then piled and burned in late fall after drying for a year and a half or so. And after the burn, we did some analysis, and for an area where it's 35 to 45% juniper, you're looking at where you have your sore spots, about 8 to 15% of the area was affected by that pile. In this particular site, there's not been really an annual problem. It's mostly western needlegrass and mountain sage, and those hot spots actually are getting filled in pretty nicely with the natives. So not really an annual problem on this particular site. Some benefits to the mechanical, when we look at ecological benefits, recovery is going to be faster than prescribed fire or wildfire. Herbage production, species diversity, all going to increase. Extended growing season, particularly the first few years after any mechanical, you generally have a 4 to 8 week longer green period. And that's particularly when you're in when you've done a treatment on a phase 3 woodland. The other benefits are you retain your shrub component, improve the hydraulic attributes pretty effectively as the ground cover, particularly on these areas where the soils are shallow, not necessarily the deeper ones. And habitat for wildlife. I'll let the third speaker talk about that a little more in depth. Management, another thing that mostly can be applied year round, and control is easy. But there are problems with these mechanical treatments. One is that can benefit weeds. We found that on some of the drier sites where you have Thurber's needlegrass as the dominant understory grass, laying those trees over the herbers will kill that grass. The idle fescue is not nearly as affected as when you lay the trees over on that, but Herbert's Neilgrass definitely gets taken out. Juniper and shrubbery invasion, of course, you never get all the trees when you do a mechanical, so that they can reoccupy a site pretty quickly. And actually, the density seems like it's even higher than it was prior to the treatment. Grazing, if you get a real, if you remember going back to the fuel treatment slide where you had a area that was just covered in dead juniper, you're not going to be able to graze that very easily. Cow's going to have a hard time getting around and accessing that. Plus, gathering them is going to be a problem as well. Management, some of these mechanical treatments can be pretty expensive, particularly when you're looking at heavy machinery compared to prescribed burning, of course. Without treatment, you can have a fuel hazard with these trees if they're not, something's not done with them. So in most cases, in the past, they didn't do as much cleanup, but in most cases now, all these fuel hazards are pretty much taken care of with some sort of post-treatment management. Probably going to try an additional treatment, so it's not as long-lasting as a fire treatment. Usually within 15 to 25 years, these areas are going to have to be retreated for the little junipers that have grown up in those areas. So, and any of these mechanical treatments, particularly any kind of cutting, can be difficult to see without that tree removal. I mean, you can broadcast it, but broadcasting doesn't work very well, at least not in our area, unless you're above about a 12 to 14 inch precip zone. Below that, broadcasting just doesn't work very well. For prescribed burning, so we'll look at woodland phase, an ecological site, and also look at some partial cut and burn treatments we've done where we just use some cut trees to carry fire through these stands. With phase 1 and 2 woodlands, you can expect herbaceous recovery within 2 to 3 years and production within 2 to 4 years, depending on how much mortality you had. If you have more shrubs you have in the system, you tend to have a little more severe fires, so your grasses are going to be knocked back somewhat, but usually they recede pretty quickly. And that'll usually it's by the second year that you have a heavy seed crop, and so when you start seeing recruitment is usually that third or fourth year after the fire. Shrub recovery is variable. It depends what species of sagebrush. On mountain sage, that seed usually stays in the seed bank and also tends to be in higher precip zones. So you almost always have new shrubs coming in the first year after the fire. With Wyoming big sagebrush or basin big sage, that can be variable. Just kind of depends on your post-fire weather. If you're generally the Wyoming in our area is below 12-inch precip zone, and if you don't have a good year in terms of precip, you're not going to get any recruitment on Wyoming, and so it takes longer to come back in. For phase 3 woodlands, herbaceous recovery is usually 3 to 4 years post-fire, sometimes longer, depending on what kind of mortality you had. Generally, these phase 3 woodlands burn a lot hotter, so you can lose up to 90% of your perennial bunch grasses with the pretty close stand of juniper. Production, again, at least 4 years or more to recover that. Shrub recovery is, again, variable. It depends a lot on your shrub species and ecological site. Mountain sagebrush tends to come back in a little faster, but if it has been depleted, it may take longer. Some of our areas we've worked on where phase 3s have been burned, the sagebrush has taken about 10 years to really show any kind of increase in those areas. And by 20 years, maybe it's starting to come back in. Now, on a phase 1 or 2 woodland, you can get back to full shrub recovery within as short as 12 years, although the average is about 30. For partial cut and burn, we've done quite a bit of work with this where we go in and on phase three woodlands particularly is cut about up to a third of the trees. Sometimes you can go a lot lower than that, depending on how thick the juniper are. The idea here is to use those cut trees to carry fire up into the remaining live trees and take those out. And that takes quite a bit of heat off the ground as well, instead of just cutting all the trees and then burning it. As to number of trees, like I said, we've had success with 15 to 33% of the trees cut for fall fire. And then for spring fire, this was aspen. These were aspen stands that we did, and about 50 to 80% of the trees were juniper trees were cut in the aspen stands and had very good kill on the remaining junipers in those areas. Here's a study we did up on Steens in the mountain big sage Idaho fescue communities, and we compared recovery on phase 2 and phase 3 juniper woodlands. The phase 2 woodlands recovered nicely at a native dominant. The phase 3, where we had a lot higher temperatures, like I said, over 90% of the perennial bunch grasses were killed on this particular area. And so we had cheatgrass and ceanothus come back in. The first were dominating these areas for at least the first decade after the fire. We've continued to study this area, and the phase 2s, of course, have come back with more shrubs and good understory component. The phase 3s have actually recovered. This graph here shows native herbaceous in green and non-native herbaceous in the gray. And you can see in 2003, the phase 2, which is P2, and phase 3 is P3. It's all native. And the first year after the fire stayed native. And then you started seeing the non-native cheatgrass coming in mostly in 2005. And it pretty much dominated those areas for up until about 2018, where we started picking up more perennials reestablishing in these cheatgrass areas. And by 2023, they're pretty much identical in terms of non-native cheatgrass in the area. And the herbaceous is a little lower on the phase 3, and that's mostly because shrub cover was a lot higher on the phase 3 woodlands than the phase 2. That's mostly because we had ceanothus, but a lot of other shrubs that had come in, snowberry and sagebrush. So if you're patient, sometimes you see a good turnaround, but it may take a while. My recommendation on this would have been on the phase 3 woodlands. I would have seeded those areas with the native bunch grasses. I wouldn't have waited to let it recover naturally, because there's always a risk that that isn't going to happen. And we've seen enough cases of that where that has occurred, where the cheatgrass continues to dominate 20, 30 years after the fire. So woodland phase 1 and 2s, I would say you get pretty predictable results with fire or mechanical, and generally do not require further inputs in terms of seeding, especially, or herbicide control of non-natives. The phase 3 woodlands, you get pretty predictable results when you're doing mechanical or jackpot burning, but you less predictable outcomes when you're dealing with broadcast burning, particularly in the fall. So in those cases, I think general rule up here is phase 3 woodlands burn, it should be reseeded. So benefits of fire, pretty similar to your mechanical. Increase in herbaceous production. Depends on how much it has to recover. So anywhere from a 2 to 7-fold increase. Species diversity also depends, but usually there's at least a doubling, sometimes a 5-fold increase in species diversity of the herbaceous layer. And you usually get a few surprises, meaning species that you don't see prior to the burn, but they show up after the burn. And some of these are the more what they consider more the rare forb species. Um, Extended growing season with fire, that's going to last for a few years until it starts filling in with the shrubs. But usually their growing season is extended from 4 to 8 weeks, depending on the site. Hydraulic improvements, that might take a couple years. Um, the other benefit is somewhat of a historic disturbance, except when maybe you're getting into these phase 3 woodlands where you get extremely hot fires and you're killing a lot of your understory. Management, lower cost per acre. You can treat larger areas, of course, and the treatment lasts longer than mechanical. So you don't have to continually go back in every 15 to 20 years to treat juniper. Problems, well, it can benefit weeds, uh, particularly if you get a high kill on your understory. In this particular area here, you can see the cheatgrass is dominating and hasn't changed in 20 years. A few more shrubs, but the cheatgrass is still the dominant understory. What we've also found with a lot of these woodlands have thickened up, a lot more of our old trees get taken out. We've even killed old trees when we weren't burning by just getting a few firebrands up into the top of the old trees, and it burns from the top down. Delayed shrub recovery possible, particularly if you're moving into the more drier type sagebrushes, Wyoming big sage, basin big sage. Mountain big sage seems to come back as long as there's some remnant shrubs in the area that have set seed in the seed bank. And after the fire, a lot of times those shrubs do come back in. You can worsen hydraulic attributes, particularly if it's dominated by the annual, of course. So you got more runoff and erosion. Management problems are, as anyone who works with fire, probably lost control once in a while. I have, which can increase your cost, and they start burning out of your control area. Grazing management, the recommendation is at least 2, sometimes more years where cows are kept off an area for an area to recover, and that's particularly if you're going to reseed it. At least for reseeding, you're looking at probably 2 to 3 years that you're going to have to keep off an area so those plants can establish. And additional inputs, of course, would be your seed cost, but also any kind of herbicide treatment that you're doing on the annuals, and that's fairly expensive. So we have done some seeding studies. Again, a lot of that success depends on your site characteristics and woodland phase and your treatment type. We tend to go with natives on areas that are above 14 inches precip, but that might be different down in your area. Once you get below 12, you're looking at you're probably going to want to, if you want to have a successful establishment, you're looking at some sort of a non-native grass, like any kind of the crested wheatgrass or Siberian wheatgrass works just fine. For introduced bunch grasses, yeah, below 12 inches, and then on south and west slopes, below 14 inches. We're about 6,000 feet in our area. And native bunch grasses, anything above about 12 to 14. Kirk has done a lot of work with reseeding sagebrush, and it's very successful for mountain sage. In fact, almost too successful. You see on that lower picture there, those are all sagebrush seedlings that were seeding into a burn on a phase 3. I tend to shy away from recommending seeding sagebrush. Usually it comes back on almost all the burns we've had. Just might take a little longer than you want. The one advantage of seeding sagebrush is that if you have too good a herbaceous understory recovery, you have a real problem trying to reseed sagebrush into those areas. It just doesn't compete well with the with a pretty much a closed stand of herbaceous. So it may not be as successful as you want. Hydraulic recovery on post-fire usually takes 1 to 3 years. Mechanical, it can recover almost immediately, or it may take longer. Just depends how quickly the herbaceous can fill in. It doesn't take that long, even on, you only need maybe 20% herbaceous cover on these areas to really slow down any kind of runoff or erosion, unless you get a real thunder bumper in the summer. And of course, it is site dependent, depending on what woodland phase was treated or the ecological site. It's usually more of a, or hydraulic recovery is more of a problem as you get into treatments on phase 3 woodlands, where you may have a lot more bare soil. So in that case, there have been some work done with leaving some of the trees on site to catch some of that runoff, and that can be effective. But most cases, most of those trees are going to be taken off in today's juniper management just because of the fuel hazard. It does reduce sheet erosion if you do a treatment. This was a study we did up on Steens almost 20 years ago now, with juniper removed and juniper in place. And you can see depending on the storm event, the treated area didn't start running off till almost your 100-year storm event. And this would have been about 15 years after our treatment. And the untreated juniper woodland, this was a very shallow soil site. So it was running off with just a 2-year storm event. So there's quite a bit of runoff and sediment loss on these areas with juniper dominating the area. Herbicides, this is off of a soil water conservation district program they did up north of us. And I mean, there's definitely herbicides can be, there's different things you can do with herbicides. Of course, pellets and spray and foliar sprays, blaze and slash cuts, and squirting herbicides into the cut. What I'm talking about was done up, like I said, at Monument, and they did stem cuts and blaze cuts and slash cuts on the larger trees and had very good success with these treatments using, well, the old term's picloram, now it's Tordon, with different mixes. And blaze cuts were slightly more effective for large trees. They were able to do, I think, 900 trees a day with 2 guys, one with a saw and one with a backpack sprayer. And that was, I think, one backpack sprayer could control about 900 trees in that day that they were working on. I think that's what they were saying. And it's a 50-50 mix. So 50% Tordon, 50% water. So that's my talk for today. I've left plenty of time for questions, if there are any.
Thanks, John. If folks have questions online, you can put them in the chat. And then anyone here has it, speak up.
Yeah, I've got a question. I was wondering, for any of these sites, I mean, I don't know like when you started some of these treatments. I realized it was quite a while ago. But for some of the sites where you've gone in and actually done a retreatment for those maintenance activities, have you had any success with like total elimination of juniper at any of your sites?
Yeah, with the fires you do.
Okay.
I mean, you're still going to have seed that survives, so you're going to get little trees popping up here and there. But we had a burn about early 90s, and that took out all the trees. But there's as many trees there as there was before. They're just small, so there's still a lot of seed in the ground. So on some of these prescribed burns, you probably should consider coming back in after 30, 40 years and reburning again. And that should eliminate your seed source pretty well, because juniper takes about 50 years to mature and start producing seed. On our aspen study where we compared fall and spring burning, the spring burning was less effective in terms of taking out the little trees, but on the fall burns, just because there's such amount of seed source around the area, and the birds who eat the seed come in and crap in those aspen woodlands, and we've got as many trees in there now in those aspen woodlands as before, but they're not more than a foot tall. So all those areas need to be retreated. Problem is now is juniper's expanded so much to where we have such a seed bank, not only in those areas, but also you've got seed sources everywhere around it. So all your treatments are going to get, trees are going to come back in nice and quick.
As a follow-up to that, I've had folks ask about, so if we do the retreatment, say 15 to 20 years later, is that all we have to do, or are they going to keep coming? Like, how much do you have to do? Or have you?
With the mechanicals or fire?
You're mostly doing mechanical in this area.
Yeah, you're probably gonna have to just keep reviewing it. Because you're still gonna have seed being brought in by birds. How big are your treatments too? That might depend on how quickly it come back in as well. If you're just doing small acreages, it probably comes in faster. I don't have any evidence for that, but that's what I'd expect.
Yeah.
And don't you, at least in California, I thought on some of these mechanically treated areas, weren't they using the herbicide on the little trees? Seems to me years ago they were using foliar sprays to control a lot of those little trees.
We have done that, John, in the past. It's kind of, when we were doing a lot of treatments on private land, that was happening. It feels like people are not doing as much of that as before. Some of the stuff has gone off label too. That's been part of the problem. Like the pellets now, we don't have a label in California.
Yeah. And I think the pellets are more of a pain in the butt than, because depending on how tall the tree is, I think, isn't it one pellet per foot, or one pellet for every couple inches in diameter, or something like that?
Right, it's by stem diameter, I think.
Yeah, I think stem diameter. So I like the foliar spray. I like what they did in John Day with the smaller trees, where they lopped the top of the tree off and then they just squirted right into that open spot on those small trees, and then it killed the trees. And you can move pretty fast to an area doing that.
Don, have you ever tried just going around with like a propane torch and torching some of those little trees coming back in?
Oh,
in the winter, it seems like they take off pretty good. You don't really have any things.
yeah, we actually have done that, but at Squaw Butte, the experimental range, we use just drip torches. We just go around, get the little trees with a drip torch. It's real cold. The trees are pretty dry, and they will burn. Once you get those kind of cold winter days, you can take out those smaller trees.
I think that dryness is important for doing that, because we've done those treatments, say in March, like now, and everything's so wet. And then you see the tree kind of burn up, but it doesn't get hot enough to kill it a lot of times. I mean, you kill some, but you don't kill 100%.
Yeah, you have to really pour the fuel to it.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, you got to wait for them to dry. In the wintertime, we've used we have a flamethrower we've used on trees, and that works real well in the winter, because they're not holding much water in the tree anymore. So if they've got, even with a flamethrower, it's surprising how hard it is to burn them, if they've been sucking up water. They just don't want to burn. So that live fuel moisture is pretty important when you're trying to burn a live tree like that, even the little ones. Um, that was a mistake I did years ago on Squaw Butte where we did a prescribed burning. I knew the live fuel moisture was really low that fall, and it really took off on us. So
I was also wondering if, you have any information on, like, it looks like most of the treatments that you've done, they're still like dead, whether it's standing or dead and down material from the junipers.
yeah.
Information on like decomposition rates and how long that might be taking.
Oh, the trees, they take a long time.
Yeah,
The needles are some of the slower, even needles are one of the slowest decomposing conifers when you compare them to other types of conifer trees. It's probably because of the environment it's in. But yeah, we have our oldest treatments. The trees are, it was a cut treatment. Yeah, those trees are still there on the ground. There's some breakdown, but it's going to take a while.
and those are what,
And,
like 50 years old? Those
whew, I don't know. Well, some of our work done on the Butte, you can see where the old fires have come through that area because you've got the snags, but you also got a lot of logs on the ground, and they've been there since whenever the last time it burned, which is probably before settlement. So, yeah, the trees stay a while, but you know the other the small diameter stuff goes away pretty reasonably fast, I guess. That can be a problem with some of those any kind of the mechanical grinders as you get into these thicker stands of juniper. You can leave a lot of mulch on the ground, which could be a problem. I think they had some problems on that down in Nevada with wildfire coming through those areas and that mulch burning up. Now, the early succession woodlands using the grinders, you hardly notice it after a couple of years. So I think they work real nice on those areas, but the heavy areas where it's really thick juniper, I'd probably cut and pile those ones.
Yeah, part of the reason I was wondering, and maybe we'll get into this a bit later, just in terms, most of the juniper work we're focusing on here at this time is to benefit sage grouse habitat, and so leaving a lot of dead, particularly standing trees can be problematic. And I'm not sure if the focus of most of the treatments that you've been working on was related to sage grouse habitat improvement, but if it was, I'd be curious, like if you are seeing increases in sage grouse numbers in these areas, even that much
Grouse,
left.
yeah, we haven't monitored the grouse. I think but it has been pretty effective where they have done it down. They did a big study down around Lakeview, and they did a lot of juniper treatments down there, and I guess it has helped the sage grouse quite a bit. Yeah, so with the grouse, I know that what they do here is the recommendation is they want everything cut down below 4 feet. I don't quite understand that because usually there's a lot of trees around anyway, so there's always perch trees. Seems like a waste of money to me. But we actually have found sage grouse nests right near trees, so I don't know if they were successful or not because we just found the eggs with the hen on it.
And then I just have one last question, related to, it looked like most of your treatments were, like above 5,000 feet. I'm wondering if you have many case studies like in that 4,000 to 5,000 elevation range?
No, because yeah, our lowest elevation here is about 4,000.
Gotcha. Okay.
Now we do have some of our treatments are below 5,000, and that'd be at our experimental range. Those are probably about 4,500. Those are kind of different sites, though. They like some of our higher elevation sites are actually worse for cheatgrass than the ones around our experimental range. Just depends on, it really depends on what type of site you have. So the mountain big sagebrush site seems to be pretty resilient, but it's the Wyoming and basin sites that you may get a good native response in terms of shrubs and herbaceous, but you're still going to get a major increase in cheatgrass on those areas just because they like those kind of warmer sites compared to the cooler ones. So soil temperature is another one to look at. Yeah, Lee Edelman did a lot of work with juniper removal over by Prineville, and maybe Carlos can relate. They've got that the watershed study over by Prineville as well, and I think that's lower elevation. I think those sites were in pretty good shape at one, and not a lot of cheatgrass. So it kind of depends on your soil type and what your major sagebrush is in that particular area.
We have a couple questions in the chat. We've only got a couple minutes here, but if you have a chance, John, we can answer these. One is, any thoughts about what an acceptable fire return interval might look like once an area has had some success in initial treatment? Or what?
Well, I would say a lot of the areas that were burned here in this area in the last 30 years. Well, we have one fire, 35 years old. That one needs to be reburned. And then the one, this one that I talked about, which is about 25 years old now, that probably should be reburned in the next 10, 15 years. I think once you get the fire back into an area, then you can start maybe lengthening your reburn. But a lot of these mountain sagebrush sites probably burn every 40 to 80 years, I would say.
Okay.
So that's what kind of return interval you'd be looking at.
And then another question is, how long does it take a burned standing dead juniper to tip over?
Sometimes they don't, sometimes they do. So I wouldn't camp under one.
Don't set your tent up there.
Yeah, so most of them do fall over eventually, but there's always going to be a few that remain as snags.
Yeah. Well, thanks, John. We really appreciate it. For our next speaker, we have Dr. Carlos Ochoa.
Thank you all for the invitation and for being here. So I was asked to talk about this long-term study that we have in Oregon, where we've been kind of studying the hydrology and to some extent the ecology of what happens with juniper removal. So before I go on, I want to acknowledge the long-term collaboration with the Hatfield Highland Trust, formerly known as the Hatfield High Desert Ranch in Central Oregon, and also the BLM Prineville District in particular, and a lot of people on Crook County as well. So this project started back in 1994 at the request of rancher Doc Hatfield, and in collaboration with Tim DeBoot and Mike Fisher, at that point a student, and Dr. Jon Bates, emeritus professor, was sadly passed last year, but was a long-term collaborator on this project as well. So they are the pioneers of this study, and I took over the project started in 2013. And since then, we've been kind of compiling a lot of information and adding new gadgets and all the stuff that goes with it. So with that said, you probably already know this thing. This is just a refresher and on the relation to juniper. It's a widespread species or a series of species from central Mexico all the way up to BC in Canada. But for our particular case, for you guys in Northern California and for us in Oregon and pretty much everything is a Western juniper, right? Juniper occidentalis. That's the main species. Where there is like in Central Oregon, it's mostly a solo stand of juniper. But I know in areas where you guys are at, it also has it's a mixed conifer type of thing there. So it is not always a solo stand, but sometimes is associated with ponderosa and other conifers as well. It's not a typical PJ because I don't think we have pinon in any locations as far as I know. But anyway, so if you can read there, tons of money and tons of effort has been put into treating juniper the last 20 some years. You know, BLM, NRCS, and in the case of Oregon, the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, tons of money there, and still people is asking, what are the benefits of removing juniper, right? So hopefully this project that we have provides some answers. Obviously, that's not the answer for everything, but it will help understand a little bit of the dynamics that happen with the water and some of the vegetation. So as I mentioned before, the project started in '94, and by 2005, or starting in 2005, about 90% of the juniper was removed in one of the watersheds. That's about 230-acre watershed that what we refer as to the treated watershed. And typical chainsaw treatment, in this case was a lopin scatter. They left most of the vegetation there, but the bolts were removed out of the system. But a lot of the debris was left there, and this is very important for some of the. If we get to discuss that, some of the carbon dynamics that happen, some of the nutrient cycling, that's why these lopin scatter treatments are important for that sort of thing. So anyway, so the original treatment was comparing this treated versus the untreated watershed. They've been called a pair watershed study, but in hydrology, we know that there's no such thing as a pair watershed, particularly in natural landscapes. There's no way you can have that. Yet that is just the terminology that's commonly referred to. So it's just a comparison of two landscapes, one with juniper and the other one where juniper was removed. When I came here, we added this component about trying to understand what happens with the lowlands, right? How do we get to the connectivity of the treatment and the headwaters or in the upper watersheds, and what happens in the riparian sites there. In this particular case, is part of the Camp Creek Meadow area. So whatever happens in those watersheds kind of eventually drains into these areas, and that's important. So we're in a semi-arid location, about 13 inches of precipitation on average. So we have been doing tons of monitoring over the years. This is just some images showing a few of the things that we commonly do, from transpiration sensors to measure how much water the juniper uses, to measure how much water comes out of the springs, or how much moisture is in the soils, what are the soil carbon, soil nitrogen, the vegetation, the groundwater, runoff, all that stuff. So you name it. So we try to measure as much as possible all the components of the water budget and some of the abiotic factors that go along with that, meaning vegetation and meaning soils and geology as well. So I'm just going to jump straight into some of the results because I know we have limited time. So hopefully we'll cover most of this information in the results, and then we can have some time for questions and answers. So here's some snapshot of some of the images related to how things were before, during, or about, a couple of years after the treatment, and up to last year when we redid some of these transects again. So we have these about 8 permanent transects in each watershed, and they've been monitored sporadically over the years. So we have hopefully a good account of, I think the first one started in 95. We have some images from 95 and up until last year, and we'll repeat it again this year in terms of measuring those things. But the important thing here is some of the findings so far. So as you can see there, brush cover mostly is sagebrush, was about 8% or 10% in both watersheds, pre-treatment levels, right? Then by last year, so we had 28% of sagebrush or brush recovery and the treated watershed, while the untreated pretty much remains the same that it was before, slightly lower, but say that's error of the measurement. So basically 28% increase or 20% increase over the 8% that it was and stay the same in the untreated one. So for those of you in habitat for sage grouse and all these things, this is a huge accomplishment to see in the treated watershed. In the case of the juniper cover, actually was more in the now treated watershed, and which now has been reduced to about less than 3%. And in the untreated watershed, that has been actually increasing there. So that's kind of, that tells us or let us know that this system is still growing in terms of encroachment. So it still has more room to become fully encroached, even though it's already a phase 3, but it can get worse than what it is already. So it is bad, but it's not too bad, put it that way, because we have pretty good forest production, yet the main thing is that the brush has been replaced basically by the juniper. You can see this images there, the progression of how things have changed or not changed ever since. So we have, here's another part of the information. This is based on data we collected in 2014 and then in 2018. It's a combination of data sets there. But in 2014, we have 31% cover. I think we also measured that same thing in 2018. And that translates about 68 trees, mature trees. By mature, we refer to anything that is kind of greater than 5 feet on the crown diameter. And also we have about 260, 255 saplings per acre in both watersheds. So here's the important thing is like in the treated watershed, you have a significant amount of saplings coming back, and you can see in the images there how they are already popping up. Most of this thing is since treatment. Some of that is left over. They were pretty little when they cut the juniper, so nobody saw them. But a lot of this thing has been grown over the last 20 years, meaning within the post-treatment period. So, but the most critical thing here is for the untreated watershed, where you have already the mature trees with that phase 3 juniper encroachment. And then on top of that, you have the same number of saplings that you get on the untreated watershed. So that's what I was telling you about how this keeps encroaching or expanding within the landscape and will shock the system eventually. I don't know when, 40, 50 years from now, but it's growing basically. So some of the things that we have seen since the treatment, you can see a couple photographs courtesy of Tim DeBoo there for the pre-treatment and post-treatment. I think it's 2004 one and 2006 the other one, something like that. And then the one that we took 20 years post-treatment in the watershed and treated watershed. You can see the dramatic difference in the landscape from before and right after and 20 years later, right? How particularly in terms of the brush cover, as I was mentioning. But also in terms of herbaceous yield, forest production in general. So you can see there right at the center, we have taken measurements of these 4 years, and it's pretty much a 3-to-1 ratio, close to 3-to-1 ratio of pounds per acre in the treated versus the untreated. Doesn't mean that the untreated watershed is bad. It's just that is way more, is much more forest on the other one. So you can see the conditions of the landscape in that photograph. Those are not bad. Those are perennial grasses, very common, very typical for the region. But much better in the treated watershed overall. However, when we look at the cover pretty much for this graph, this again from our 2014 study there, so you get about 6% cover at the time and 50 some for the untreated. But the main thing again is the shrub. We have more shrub, more annual grasses, about the same amount of FORF, and of course 30% cover for the untreated in terms of trees, and at that time was less than 1% on the treated one. So it is quite dramatic the difference in vegetation as well, whether it's cover or yield. So that's another response that we have seen. So here are some of the transects over time, right? From again for that watershed, the treated watershed, a couple of these different transects. I think I already showed you treated versus untreated. This is for both of the treated. See how the landscape looks like. And some of the other studies that we have been doing, so we did a first 3-year round back in it was 2017 to 2019, something like that. And then we estimated how much water the trees use. You can see these trees there. These trees are huge, as you know. Juniper can grow. I think these are close to 50, even more than feet in height. So they're pretty tall trees. But also we measured the saplings. You can see on the photograph on the left, this couple little sapling there. That time was about 4 feet tall. And you see those wraps on at the bottom. That's where the sensors were to measure the sap of meaning, and then we translate into how much water the trees use. So overall, during the active period, meaning the spring through the fall, juniper on average consumes the trees that we measure, these big trees consume about 23 gallons per day on average for that period of time. But they can get pretty high during the summer, 40 and more, up to almost 50 gallons a day. But the average is 23 for those years that we measured. Whereas the saplings, they don't consume as much. It's only about, for what I recall, it's about 0.6 liters a day. So that's minimum. But yet there's a lot of them coming back, right? So eventually they grow up to a point that will start taking a vast amount of water. And that's another study that you started last year to see at what stage the junipers start taking more water as they grow. But anyway, so out of those numbers, we came out with some rough calculations back of the envelope. So don't quote me on these ones because those are just pretty crude numbers that we came out with. There's a lot of caveats you have to go to this thing, but it gives you a rough estimate of how much water you are expected to save if you were to remove the juniper. Now, where the water goes and what has been utilized after the trees are not being used, are not there anymore, that's a different story. But in terms of how much water they're using, you can see that it's about 74,000 gallons per acre per year. And then on top of that, you add how much of the saplings and some of the other smaller trees that we didn't account for. So it's a significant amount of water that you can expect to see going somewhere else, whether it's to other vegetation or to the groundwater system or to the runoff. That's different. Anyway, so in terms of precipitation and soil moisture, it's another study that we did back in 14 and 15. I had a grad student did her master's thesis on this, and she had roughly 400 transects throughout the 2 watersheds that she went and measured about every 2 months or so to see what was the top soil moisture conditions there. And you can see the progression from the very dry times in July to the very wet times, mostly in March and then into May, which is the spring runoff. Very typical for the Pacific Northwest in terms of precipitation in the winter and the snowmelt runoff in the spring, right? So, and the other thing is we have these monitoring stations. You can see we have sensors at different depths, 4 inches all the way down to 30 inches, 32 inches there to see. And we've been kind of monitoring the seasonal fluctuations of soil moisture and the two watersheds. And for a number of years, we've been having usually 4 to 5 stations in the years. Last year, we installed a bunch more. Now we have about 14, 15 stations total. But this is, starting last year. So from the last 10 to 12 years on those stations that we already had, so we came out with this analysis and determined that on average for the two watersheds, for each of the watersheds, there is a 5% difference in soil moisture content, higher for the treated watershed versus the untreated watershed. So 5% is a huge amount of water for desert landscapes. That difference itself is humongous there. So the fact that it's pretty much consistent throughout the entire year and exacerbates during the summertime, that tells us that the treatment worked the way it was supposed to in terms of releasing moisture into the soil. Right? So some of that is reflected on the runoff. So you can see, for example, the treated watershed has usually more runoff. There's a few years of data there, for example, for the treated watershed versus the untreated. Occasionally, you have actually more water in the untreated just because of the dynamics of snow pack or snow melting and all that stuff. But for the most part, you have more water in the treated watershed every year. And the most important thing is in recent years, we also started kind of putting some check dams and the streams as well to kind of hold some of the sediment. And you can see the response in the vegetation there. So in some of the areas there, this is at the outlet of the watershed. This was pretty green there. So that's holding a lot of sediment, is building the or having the foundations for restoration in terms of the riparian landscapes. And there's still some water, cleaner water in terms of sediment, kind of going out of the watershed as compared to the untreated watershed, where a lot of the runoff it comes with very coarse sediment, a lot of the coarse gravel that comes out of the system, because yes, it holds a lot of moisture and it has good vegetation cover, but it's not enough to maintain or to clean the sediments, and that creates another water quality issue beyond the water quantity aspect. So maybe the most important thing here because we've been asking people usually questions about, well, there's not enough information about how much water is saved from Juniper costs and whatnot. So you hear that all the time. And this is unpublished data, a lot of these things. So I just need to tell you that. So hopefully this year we'll publish some of this information. But here's some of the analysis for the last 30 years based on what we have of how much water yields in terms of surface water yields we have in the treated versus the untreated watershed. So 10 years of pre-treatment era there, then it was about 9 acre-feet of water per year in the pre-treatment years. And it has been more than double over the last 20 years. You can see last year was a record one. You saw we have a pretty good winter, as you may remember. And but even without it, it was still on the higher trend, and it's still going upward in terms of the trend. So that one of the questions we had, and that's where we had the funding from OWEB, is like, okay, here we are 20 years after the treatment. Are we at the time where the benefits of this thing are going to start declining, or are we still okay in terms of seeing some of the water benefits out of the watershed? And based on this particular metric, we still are okay for that. The concern, as I mentioned before, is that a lot of that juniper is coming back. So I don't know, we still evaluating, probably still have another 20 years or so before we really need to treat, although my preference would be to treat now. But anyway, so this is in terms of the surface water yields. It's an unequivocally good metric to show. That also, those are the acre feet per year, but it's also consistent with in terms of how many days of flow we had from the watershed. Is not so much that all the water come at once, but it's just that the period of stream flow extends way more in the treated watershed versus the untreated. So that's what makes the difference there. Of course, we have some years that the water wasn't as good or that sort of thing. So it's typical of this kind of long-term observation type of studies. So some of the dynamics that are very interesting to see here, and this is a particular importance, like when I give this talk or similar talk to folks that are interested in juniper, but mostly in the Southwest, I need to emphasize this thing because of the winter precipitation we have in the Pacific Northwest. A lot of the dynamics mean that the vegetation is not active in terms of transpiration during the winter, right? So there is more chances for the soil to get saturated and for that water to drain into to the aquifer. So just for kind of illustration purposes, you have the precipitation there in a given year. And then in the middle, the graph, you have the three different depths that we're monitoring for soil moisture. And then on the bottom, we have the data from 3 monitoring wells that we have. So basically, you see that in the summer, there's some precipitation, but that only kind of recharges the soil moisture to that depth. But none of that really makes it into the aquifer, right? So that doesn't happen until kind of late fall into the winter when the soil really gets saturated. And then because of the over excess saturation of the soil, so some of that water makes it into the aquifer. And that's where you see the response that kind of lasts until late May or June. So similar things happens to spring flow, right? So same thing, we have greater soil moisture, there's more runoff, but also there is more spring flow in general here. This one, we have to be cautious, and I will explain that a little bit later, but there's definitely more spring flow in the treated watershed, but some of that can be confounding as whether it's from the treatment or is from more of the natural regional groundwater system. But the most important thing here is the very strong correlation with the moisture and spring flow data that we have collected there. So therefore, you can use soil moisture as a proxy for estimating spring flow to some extent. So here's the data again, aggregated for the last 30 years or so. No, 20 years of data is aggregated into this graph. These numbers 1 to 12 there are the months of the year, starting January to December. And basically that tells you how many gallons per minute of spring flow are in the treated watershed, meaning maize, and the untreated watershed. Just by a visual comparison of the graphs, you can see that there's way more spring flow coming out of the treated watershed versus the untreated. And also that the spring flow lasts way longer, pretty much it's all year long in the treated watershed, whereas on the other one pretty much goes flat around October, November, sometimes in September. And peak flow at both of them happens in month 4 or April, pretty much at the peak of the snowmelt runoffs season. Again, some of that depends on the timing, the magnitude of the winter precipitation. And I also want to say the type of precipitation. So we have years where the precipitation is not dominated. Those are the best years in terms of water response. But also we have a mix of rainfall and snow. Those are so good. But sometimes we also have rainfall. The years are dominated by rain. And even though they generate some geo, that's not as good as the snow melt systems. But also over the last 20 years since we started monitoring this thing, or 20 some years, we've been able to kind of capture very wet periods, but also this drought that we all experienced, a couple of years ago. So you can see the response in the data there was pretty much very low. And then the recovery coming out of that in 23, 24, and 2025 there, but not to the levels that were in the wet season. So that tells you sort of how resilient the system can be and how long it's going to take for it to recover yet. So we haven't seen full recovery yet in the last 3 years, but it's getting there. And so here's another, in terms of, remember I mentioned the riparian area there, so you can see a photograph of how it looks like. The most important thing here is the timing and the response, and also how long it stays into the system, right? So basically, it extends beyond the runoff coming from the headwaters. That's why. So it's kind of receiving all that return flow coming from the headwaters, just catching it there in the riparian areas there. So it's just gravity basically. But that's an important thing to understand. Now, the caveat that was mentioned before, we about 2015 or so, we conducted this. We developed the hydrogeologic framework for this particular site and the surrounding area. You can see the outline of the study there that says is a Camp Creek per watershed study, right? That's what it stands for. But also you can see all those black or blue, dark blue color dots. Those are wells from the area there. And we used all that data plus the geology to kind of develop this cross-sectional transects of the geology of the area to determine where the barriers were, where the conduits of water were, where the water is going to the system. So this is on to the right of that is a water table map. Surface. So there's a water table map. See those two dots there? Those are the two springs. So we have one on each watershed. But that comes from the aquifer system, we cannot really attribute the groundwater response to what happened within the watershed, whether they're treated or. So we really have to go into understand the watershed system, which is what this map illustrates. And am I out of time? Let me know.
We still have 15 minutes. That includes questions, but if you want to go a little bit longer, that's fine.
Okay, I have a couple more, a few more. So this is the most important thing. So some of the other ongoing studies, as I was mentioning, so we started this new study about transpiration in the terms of the different trees. It's different size. We start from 4 inches diameter trees all the way up to 17 inches. You should start consuming a lot of water. We have all the soil, the uptake. We have rain gauges to see how much of that water actually makes it into the soil and that stuff. Also, we have this kind of ongoing understanding. You see these new gadgets there for measuring how much evapotranspiration is being measured at the landscape scale. And then we compared that to what the trees actually measured. And for us, is very important to see if the trees are the ones dominating the evapotranspiration component, or if it's something else. But based on this comparison on the graph that you see there, it seems like the transpiration of the trees really matches the evapotranspiration. So meaning the transpiration, the T component of the ET happening is very important. This might be different in the Southwest, where this is more dominated by the E component, the evaporation, because of the extreme heat. But here's the trees that are actually dominating most of the water being used in the landscape, which it kind of count up to 80, in some cases 90% of the total water budget. So the fact that our trees uptaking most of that water, that kind of give us some understanding of what is going to be the effects if you were to remove the trees. So that's why we're doing that study. The other thing is we're expanding. You can see the little two red things there. Those are two watersheds there. So now we have studies at 1,600 hectares, or about 3,500 acres, and another study at about 14,000 acres that we're conducting at a much larger scale to see what's going on there with those things, right? So these are some of the ongoing stuff going on with these two other studies there. Basically the same area, Crook County, Harney being kind of closer to you guys there. That is a dryer system. That's the 14,000 acres. So in a few years, we hope to have something to discuss about it. The last slide is, I'm just going to mention briefly these things. This is about the carbon thing, because that's another ask we have. It's like, well, what happens if you take out the trees, you lose all the carbon and all that stuff, right? And yes, when you remove any vegetation, you will remove some carbon out of the system. The thing is, can you make the system better in a way that compensates or offsets some of those losses? And fair enough, from this study we did back then, and a new one that we're conducting now, or the extension of that, back then we concluded that basically the increase in vegetation, the improvement in the soil conditions, the more roots from the perennial root systems and the sagebrush and whatnot, sort of helps offsetting some of the losses we got from the balls. But also because a lot of the debris was left on site, that's also counts for carbon into the system. And with that, I'll stop right there and be happy to take any questions you guys have now. And I need to stop sharing, I guess.
Got one question. I noticed in your slide there where you had 10% less moisture in the ground in April. Is that an indication of a lot of the precipitation that actually gets trapped in the canopy and does not actually make it to the soil, or the transpiration of the tree starts, or what you're feeling on that?
Okay, I sort of gather what you were saying. Can you, sorry, I'm just kind of increasing the volume here because I didn't hear you very well. Can you tell me again something about moisture in April and
Well,
please?
The significant amount of the moisture and precipitation, especially your snow, gets caught in the canopy and then evaporates before it ever reaches the ground. And your one slide that showed the soil moisture level at 10% less in your untreated areas would tend to indicate that. Do you agree with that?
To some extent, but no, in general. Let me explain why. Snow in general, because so when it happens in the winter time, we don't have a lot of evaporative losses out of that. So a lot of the interception we got from the trees, some of that moisture eventually drains down into the soil, but is gonna kind of drain out into the dripping portion of the tree canopy, right? So it's not gonna go through fall. So it's not gonna make it to the roots in there. So that's why it's a lot of interception. But in terms of evaporative losses, it's not a whole lot that is really lost during the winter. Most of the interception, because we also did another study, I didn't talk about it, but we did another study to measure interception. Most of that interception and evaporation, as you were mentioning, happens obviously during the summertime. The wintertime, a lot of this is just snow, and it freezes from December to February until it starts kind of melting. And there's a lot of that's a quick runoff coming out of the watershed. That's part of the problem there too, that is all the sudden all the snow melts and it brings a lot of sediment, coarse sediment, as I was mentioning there. So that's what we have observed in this particular case. But that's a very good point for other systems that they have Juniper. Like so I'm also very familiar. I used to live in the Southwest, and that's exactly what you're describing. And there they have much warmer winters, which much more sunshine, and there's some evaporation happening there, but not in the system we have. It's pretty cold. Does that help?
Yeah.
Good. And yeah.
A comment on the amount of water that a juniper tree uses. I find that fascinating. Has similar studies have you seen for shrubs or other species, to do a comparison of water intake?
Yeah, you know what? It'd be pretty good if, since I don't see you guys, and this is one of the things I was resistant to this online thing. Can you tell me your name and more or less where you come from, so I have a sense of that I'm not just talking to the screen?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
My name is Cindy Becker. Here in Susanville, I work for Land Trust.
Thanks. Yeah, so the question is about other studies with the other different kind of vegetation, right?
Yeah, just comparisons to juniper, even in the same system, like to understand if is that an exorbitant amount of intake for a mature tree, or is that consistent? Would that be consistent with other species?
Well, it is well, two components to the answer. One is we have conducted studies on sagebrush. We have a publication. We did it for a couple of years, and we have some numbers there for how much water sagebrush uses. So it uses similar amount than the saplings in terms of sagebrush, but it uses some water, right? So it's and that's the thing. You're replacing basically. You're removing the juniper, and then you're replacing that woody vegetation with brushes. So it's mostly sagebrush. So it will utilize some of that water. It's just which species you like better, right? That's and then, but it's not going to be the same amount for one. Now, in terms of other studies in the region, there is some study that they did nearby. By that I mean probably 40 miles away. I was going to say. In the Sisters region, they had they did it on ponderosa pine some years ago, and our juniper consumes way less than the ponderosa. For what I recall, ponderosa was I think close to 80 gallons or something like that a day, 80 to 120 depending on the size of the tree. But juniper certainly consumes quite a bit of water as well. So yes, it compares to some extent, but it depends on what you compare it to. So it's way more than a sagebrush, is way less than a ponderosa. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you. It's just thinking about drought years, depending on the timing of a treatment and the follow-up drought years or precipitation afterwards, that can also then impact restoration, like the quality of the restoration following the treatment.
You know, one thing I forgot to mention there, on that study that we did, we got a very dry year, which was 2018, and a very wet year, which was 2017. So in 2017, we have much higher precipitation. I think we recorded 15 inches, and the following year we recorded 8 inches. So roughly speaking, about half. And we saw about the same response from the trees. So when they have plenty of water, they consume as much as they could. When they have half the water, they basically consume half the water, right? So they adapted very well to whatever moisture was available, and pretty much it's almost like a 1-to-1 I don't want to say exactly, but it's pretty close to 1-to-1 ratio when there is wet versus when it's wet dry. So meaning 15 inches of precipitation pretty wet, the trees will consume a lot of water. When it's half of that, will consume half of that. So that's very important for this restoration planning, and as you come out of the drought, as we're coming out of that recovery period, as I was telling you, it's very important to understand these dynamics, because the data is showing us, it takes a few years for the whole system, particularly the shallow groundwater system, to recover. So we are not seeing, even though we have significant amounts of spring flow and the groundwater system, is not to the levels that it was before. And then we're already 3 years into the recovery phase, and pretty good winter that we have had, but it's 1 or 2 winters is not enough. A very good question. So it actually brings more questions for me than answers, but great. Okay.
Carlos, this is David Lyle with a question. Just to make sure I understand the dynamics well, the chart you had reflecting, I guess it was soil moisture in the riparian valley below the watersheds there. And looking at that relative to the runoff out of maize, is that difference being fed by subsurface flow from the watershed into the lower riparian, or is that, what is the dynamic there that's causing that delay or lengthening of the soil moisture in the bottom part?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, what I show that is groundwater levels. So we have some wells in the riparian area as well. But it's tightly related to moisture though. And the thing is, because we have that increased residence time in the upper watershed and the treated watershed in this case. So meaning the water stays longer in the watershed and is slowly released back into the system, and obviously follows gravity. So that water is kind of slowly but surely trickling down into the riparian area. That's why you have this extended period past what you see the response up on the watershed. In other words, the watershed will last up until June. First days of June, you will see runoff in a good year. Mostly by May, late May is gone. But then some of that water is still in transition down into the riparian area and is going to extend for another 1 or 2 months from there. So that's where you see that. So it's a very, for us, understanding this upland valley hydrologic connectivity, that's basically what it's reflecting to, is just this transfer of moisture from the upper watershed down into the riparian area.
Is that happening below the soil surface or above or both?
Below in this case. No, above is, like I said, done. In some cases, we don't see, there's a lot of what we refer to as hyperrake flow there. So in those watersheds, because there's a lot of fractured basalt, right? So in those most of the West, Pacific Northwest, tons of basalt. So there's a lot of the systems we deal with are very shallow soils, meaning a couple feet. And then there's a lot of fracture in the rocks there. So, and the streams, and many of the streams, unless it's during the peak runoff season, most of the water is going to go down into the channel of the stream, and then it's going to resurface down there somewhere else. So that's what we refer as to the hyperrake flow. You know, it disappears from the surface on the stream, and then it pops up down there somewhere else. So to your question, is mostly subsurface flow, what we see there popping up as when it gets to the valley, it shows us a spring. There's some of the spring there. And then also on the we're monitoring with the groundwater with the monitoring wells, but you can see the spring. So when it comes into the valley, it kind of surfaces as surface water, but also on the subsurface. But when it comes from the top of the watershed down, that transfer zone from about a 1 mile transfer zone, you don't see water in the stream, but it's coming down underneath. So we did another study some time ago where we have these sensors in the stream bed where actually shows that the water kind of transferring below the surface of the stream bed. So you don't see it in the stream, but that doesn't mean there's no water going down there and in the, in the sandbars and all that stuff.
Okay, thank you. That explains it very well.
Thank you.
Carlos, there's one question in the chat. Have you studied the effects of differences between the type of juniper cutting methods, such as lop and scatter versus pile and burn?
No, that's a very good question. You know, as we all know, pile and burn is the most common one here. Don't know yet. We haven't done the studies. The new study that we're doing there, that's basically pile and burn. So we'll see that, but I don't have any data to tell you the difference now. So short answer is we're working on it, but I don't have any information that can be useful to tell you the difference. Very good question.
Yeah, thank you. We do need to transition to our next speaker, but yeah, we really appreciate your time and all the information.
You bet. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
I'm going to give a really high-level overview of conifer management, conifer presence, conifer management on sagebrush-dependent wildlife, and talk sort of about a decade of lessons learned from a lot of great studies that have been out there. So some of this work I've been involved in, but it's really a much broader community that I'm leaning on today, and some folks will probably see themselves represented in this group. So, you know, I thought it was really, really prescient. It's about 10 years ago, almost today, that this synthesis paper came out in Forest Ecology and Management by some folks at Colorado State. It's talking about consequences of PJ woodland reduction for wildlife in North America. And basically, they did a really broad scale vote counting study on like, what do we know about different species and different guilds and the impact that forest management, conifer removal has had on them. And the really big take home was that one, there's not a ton learned, and more or less the impacts are equivocal, meaning sometimes there's positive effects, sometimes there's negative effects. More often it's non-significant. And if we really key in here on sagebrush obligate species, interesting, they found less than 20 total studies and no clear signal. And this was interesting because this was a time, at least in my conscious, when woodland management for sagebrush obligate species, in particular sage grouse, were really ramping up. And according to this review, there wasn't really a lot out there to suggest that this is an effective tool. We've come a long way since then, and I'm looking forward to sharing some of that with you today. So a quick outline of where I'm headed today is, one, I'm going to talk about what have we learned just about conifer dynamics. So kind of take a step back in the remote sensing world and just look at change in conifer extent within the sagebrush ecosystem over time. Then I'm going to talk about what have we learned about sagebrush dependent wildlife in particular. And I'm going to tell two stories. One specific to sage grouse. Obviously, that's been the currency for learning about wildlife in the sagebrush ecosystem and the impacts of conifer and what happens following conifer removal. And then some emerging information on songbirds as well, sagebrush obligate songbirds. Next, I'm going to talk about how sort of we as an agency, Fish and Wildlife Service, have moved from the species-specific approach to a more biome-wide holistic approach and share some of the findings there. And then just introduce some step-down tools that may help us move forward from, you know, going from a biome to a local perspective. So I don't think this group needs any education on sort of the nature of conifer expansion, probably, but I think it's worth pointing out that at least when I was first starting to think about these issues, a lot of what we had learned came from folks like Rick Miller and others who used pre-reens, core samples, pack rat bins, all sorts of like evidence out there to suggest that, wow, we've really got expansive post-European colonization woodland expansion across the sagebrush biome and rangelands in particular. And one of the things that I think has really been highlighted over the past decade is how remote sensing in general can help answer just like the footprint, the extent, and how much of that's going on in real time. And so I'm going to show you a few slides that Scott Morford from Working Lands for Wildlife Group had put together using some of the available tools that we have from remote sensing to get at this question of just what is the extent of pinyon juniper increase, contraction, stabilization over time. So this first slide is just a look at the footprint of PJ woodlands using a landfire biophysical setting layer, which looks at the probably emerging vegetation type from the 19th century to now, where they have this existing vegetation type product. And what you can see is that we've had about a 55% increase since the 1800s in just the footprint of PJ layer. On that figure on the right, you can see black where it stayed stable, green where we've had PJ expansion, and then potentially contraction in that purple area. And if we look at the underlying vegetation type of where that it's occurring, 70% of it, most of it's occurring in rangeland. So about 40% sagebrush and 23% other shrublands, and then 7% of grasslands within these areas. So, following past evidence, a pretty expanding footprint of PJ woodlands into rangelands. Now, if we go to some of the more Landsat-based stuff, so we can look over the past 30, 40 years of the actual cover of PJ and how it's changed, we get another story as well. And so now this is using rangeland analysis platform data or RAP data to look at actual woodland cover within these areas. And I think the thing to key in on here is that top figure in the upper left, where we look at just tree cover in millions of acres change over time and see again, this is still occurring, right? It's not just a historic issue. We've had about a 20% increase in PJ woodlands over the past, say, 34 years now. And again, you can see on that figure, there are some areas where you have localized contraction, but the story is largely expansion across the biome. You will notice as you look at some of those eco-regional breakouts in the bottom left there, you've got some dips, late 90s, early 2000s, and that corresponds with mega drought in those areas. But interestingly, we are seeing recovery in some of those areas as well. Now, this is interesting because it does line up with field studies as well. So it's not just remote sensing that's picking up on this. So if we look at like population growth rates of tree species from FIA data, field-based analysis the Forest Service puts together, interestingly, over like 5 different species of pinyon juniper trees, we've got almost universal positive population growth. So median lambda or population growth in this case is about 1.05, increased about 5% annually. And if you look at just the percent of plots that include a growing population, it's most of them for most species, with the exception of edgeless, it's about 75%. So currently, and if you look at those maps there to the top right, that shows areas in those cooler colors, blue, greens, yellows, where we have stable to increasing populations, reds where we have localized declines of populations as well. And you can see that's typically happening for edgeless around the Four Corners region. But across the biome, generally a growing population, just looking at these species individually from a population ecology standpoint. Now, when this sort of data is married up with climate projections into the future as well, it's somewhat of a similar story where we've got predicted continued growth under climate change scenarios, all climate change scenarios for 3 of 5 pinyon juniper species. And we do have some areas or certain species that are anticipated to decline. Utah juniper is anticipated to have about 50% of the highest emission areas. But again, that's spatially dependent and typically occurring within those Four Corners regions. So now let's contrast that with what's going on in the sagebrush biome. The big take home here again is that a lot of that pinyon juniper expansion is happening within the sagebrush area. So if we just look at PJ colonization of the sagebrush biome where it's growing, we can see, especially over about the past 25 years, increasing of about almost 150,000 acres annually. within that footprint. And if we just look at where that's occurring within sagebrush, so what's already identified as sagebrush areas, that's about 113,000 acres per year. You know, and to put that into context for something close to home, think of that, that's losing like something in the area of Pyramid Lake annually within this area. So what has this meant for wildlife? So again, 2 stories today, focusing on sage grouse and obligate songbirds. Before I get into that, I always think it's important to think about studies in terms of like, what did they measure? What is the state variable? Because it's very variable within wildlife populations. And what is the scale over time and space? Because it's really easy to get into that vote counting mind frame of like, well, this study said a positive effect. This one didn't find anything. This one had a negative effect. I think it's important to think about the weight of evidence of that study. And the way I like to sort of frame this is with this sliding scale of state variables going from occurrence, you know, I saw the thing or I didn't, up to maybe some sort of behavior with selection, resource selection. Then we get to counts or abundance. And then we get to the real meaty parts, right? Demographic vital rates, the underpinnings that ultimately give rise to population growth rates, lambda. And again, on that y-axis there, I've got scale, time, and space. So you can think of something like the master study occurring really local scale, maybe over 1 to 2 field seasons, up to watershed scales over longer terms. I think the first time that this really entered my mind in terms of pinyon juniper or just conifer woodlands as a threat to sage grouse was the study by Sharon Brock-Murdo up in Oregon. Maybe folks are familiar with this. But she looked at just what are the factors that give rise to lek persistence. So over time, using the lek database there, what environmental factors explain what leks stay active on the landscape? And interesting, conifer cover was one of the most important predictors. This is in with about 1 kilometer scale. And she found this 4% persistence threshold. You can see that nice hockey stick going down there where you basically have no chance of maintaining the lek once you cross that 4% threshold. And this really opened my eyes because 1, it's the first time that like you have a natural feature on the landscape that's tantamount to the effects of urbanization, oil and gas development, row crop agriculture, things that influence, that have similar effects on sage grouse lek activity rates. So there's this journalist that after that paper came out, I think that wrote like, what does that actually look like, 4%? I always love this analogy because if you think of a chessboard or a checkerboard, 4% is about three-ish of those little squares filled. So very little. And I zoomed into an area here. This is just east of Horse Lake near y'all, where I told RAP to find what's like an average of about 4% pinyon juniper cover within 1 kilometer. And that's about what it looks like. So fairly low canopy cover, at least that looks like to me, but can cross that threshold where sage grouse are no longer able to persist there. So what have we learned since then? So I'm going to sort of walk through, again, that behavior to demographics to population dynamics in terms of sage grouse. Talk about a few selected studies that have really started to shed light on the impacts of what happens among conifer landscapes when sage grouse are there. So one thing we know is sage grouse avoid placing nests in areas with as little as 3% conifer cover. So there's this 3-dimensional graph showing that, you know, once you start to exceed that 3% cover, it really drops down on the probability of selection for placing the nest. That's ameliorated somewhat if they're more clumped together. But again, it doesn't take much out there to have sage grouse avoid nesting within that area. If they can avoid it, the probability of nest success and brood survival, 2 of the most important vital rates for sage grouse population growth, decline as you have increasing conifer cover. And this was a really neat study that Pete Coates and folks did with GPS marked birds, where they showed that once birds encounter even low levels of conifer cover, as low as 1.5%, their movement rates start to speed up. And when their movement rates speed up, their vigilance goes down, and so does their survival. And so as little as 1.5% conifer cover actually impacted survival of adult females. That's sort of the 3rd most important vital rate, giving rise to population growth rates. So what about after conifer removal? You know, it's almost like instant habitat. Sage grouse tend to use these treated areas very quickly afterwards. One of my favorite stories is Charlie Sanford. He was now a partners biologist with Fish and Wildlife Service, but he was radio marking birds in Utah on a conifer removal study and found that, you know, almost the day the masticator left, he would track his birds going in there. And there's an image I couldn't find though, but it was from a GPS marked birds, I believe in Oregon, where you could see the boundaries of a recent conifer cut. And those marks of the GPS hits almost look like a ping pong ball bouncing around within it of that newly created area for sage grouse. Demographically, nest, brood, and adult survival all increase following conifer removal from studies that have tracked before and after control impact type analyses. And then I think Andrew Olson did one of the neatest, largest scale studies to show that you actually have this 12% bump in population growth rates at a watershed level when you treat to scale in these things. So we do have impacts of treatments at Lex demographically down to the individual level. And so going back to that framework, it's sort of universally found that we have these negative impacts from behavior to demography to population growth in the face of conifers, or really just any woody areas within sage grouse. And that tends to be ameliorated once it's removed. And we can see that across these different state variables and scales. And again, we're approaching almost 20 studies here. So just within sage grouse, doubling what we knew 10 years ago with some really high quality science. So typically we would stop there and say like, well, we invest really all of our time and money in sage grouse. That's the iconic keystone species for this landscape. And it really was turned into this cottage industry of like, well, how effective are sage grouse as an effective surrogate or an umbrella species for the rest of the sagebrush biome, right? There's 349 or so other critters out there that we care about, but we use sage grouse as sort of the metric to track this. And so there have been a lot of interesting studies that said, how well are sage grouse an umbrella for the other critters that are out there? And so I put together this like really back of the napkin review that tracked all the studies that have looked at sage grouse surrogacy efficacy for a broader wildlife community. And then I tried to put them on like this idea of a spatial scale. So like at what spatial scale did they evaluate sage grouse as a surrogate? So that fourth order all the way left on there, think of that as like where something likes to place its nest, individual movements from GPS data. As we move forward to the third order, that's more like home range, winter habitat area or seasonal habitat area for a species. And then further right on there, we get to the sort of biome level. And I think the take home here was that as we looked at how effective are sage grouse as a surrogate for birds, reptiles, small mammals, at that biome to sort of third order, think of that as like seasonal habitat selection scale, almost universally they found positive influence. And it really only breaks down where sage grouse are an effective surrogate for other species when we get to that really localized scale, fourth order. The point being here, if we step back and say, yeah, if sage grouse are influenced by conifer cover and benefit from removal, targeted removal, it probably extends benefits to the other species as well. And I think songbirds is sort of the next sort of guild of species that we're starting to learn about that. So some of the work by Aaron Holmes up in Oregon, gosh, this is almost 10 years ago now, was the first to show that post-removal, we have accounts of songbirds, sagebrush dependent songbirds, near doubling up to 3 years post-removal. In a recent range-wide analysis by Alex Kumar found that avoiding tree cover was almost the number one explanatory factor in counts of birds using BBS data, so a large biome-wide monitoring tool. Almost unequivocally, tree cover was the major predictor in that, in the negative response of tree cover. Over about the past 5 years or so, there's been this really neat case study in Southwest Montana that took these sort of before after control, same framework, and really dived into the counts, the demography, what happens to songbirds in the face of conifer removal. So you can see it sort of up there in the upper left there. This is Beaverhead County. This actually isn't so much PJ as it is Doug Fir and Ponderosa treatments that they're working on there. But you can see those blocks where they've treated, and Elise Zari, the student on this, set up a really nice study where she mapped territories, tracked nests, tracked fledglings over about a 5-year period. And what was really cool is that brewer sparrows, she saw an increase in just pair abundance, right? So pairs per hectare, we see an increase there significantly for brewer sparrows. And we actually start to see sage thrashers in this area where they hadn't seen them before in these untreated areas. That's typically where studies have stopped, but she actually got that daily nest survival. And so you can see that, major significant increase in nest success among brewer sparrows. Again, we actually have sage thrashers now where we didn't in the control areas. And that's daily nest success. So if you actually propagate that out to nest survival over, say, the full incubation and fledgling period, that's a near doubling of nest survival overall for brewer sparrows in these treated areas. And then ultimately recruitment, again, we see a near doubling of recruits kicked out per hectare for brewer sparrows and sage thrashers again, entering that area. Now, this was really neat. What Elise ended up sticking around and doing for a postdoc then was sort of to take a retrospective look and then a forward look as well. So she used this tool from Landscape Explorer, where old USGS orthoquads were actually digitized. So we got a conifer cover in the 1950s in this area and compared that to information from the rangeland analysis platform today. So you can sort of see that historically, we've got conifer cover there in that map, and then how that actually looks like on the landscape. So it's about 5% tree cover then. Currently, where we do have more tree cover, we've seen a growth despite all the management that's happened in there. So it's been almost a double or tripling of conifer cover. And then she grew that out based on seedling dispersal models and some other remote sensing tools that she used to say, what happens in a future where we continue to manage early phase conifer cover within this area? That's that third bar there. And so you can start to see some infill where those areas get darker within existing woodlands, but still among those areas where she tends to have those territories now, management continues to happen. And then she looked at the future with no action. So what happens if we walk away from that landscape and don't continue to treat conifers within that area? And what she was able to do then is take all those models that she developed from her PhD and apply them back in time and space, and found that, well, gosh, we've lost about almost 50% of our potential fledglings based off, 1950 data to now. If we continue to treat, we're able to stabilize this population. However, left unchecked, we're going to lose about another 60% of our recruitment potential within this area. A really strong case for the continued management with areas that we've already been in. And so I focused on sage grouse and songbirds, but lots of other studies have started to crop up on different taxa too, whether it's pygmy rabbits, mule deer from watershed level experiments in Colorado showing that you have increased ingesta level body fat in mule deer going into that pregnancy season in areas that were treated, to small mammals, to reptiles as well. So a really robust body of literature starting to come out on this. Now, as I mentioned, in the past, we've used species as our currency for targeting conservation, for thinking about threats. A lot of the people can remember sage grouse priority areas for conservation. And something that's happened probably over the past 5 years is that we've shifted, at least at this biome-wide level, to more of an ecosystem-based approach. And so a lot of folks may be familiar with this, the sagebrush conservation design. Technical report came out in 2022. And then last year, I guess a year and a half ago now, there was a special issue in Rangeland Ecology and Management that stepped down a lot of the science from this. But at its highest level, the idea was to map sagebrush ecological integrity as a function of sagebrush, perennial grasses, things that we appreciate on the landscape in terms of an ecologically intact sagebrush system. And then it's sort of demerit points for annual grasses, conifers, and human modification. And the way I like to think of it is Chad Boyd from ARS in Oregon always said, this is sort of the model that if you were to drive around this landscape at 55 miles per hour, we could all sort of agree on, yeah, this is a great landscape. It's got all the components here. We've got healthy amount of sagebrush, a perennial understory, not really any threats in terms of annual grass, conifers, human infrastructure on the landscape. And so it took all those continuous values of SEI and broke it down into what we call core sagebrush areas, growth opportunity areas where maybe there's 1 or 2 threats present, and then other rangeland areas which may have threats present or just aren't quite sagebrush, type landscapes yet as we move towards the periphery of the range. I think one of the really cool things with this as we move to more of the species agnostic approach was to say, well, hey, are we robbing Peter to pay Paul moving forward in terms of like this, something that's just based off functional groups? And so as part of that special issue, there was a really 2 neat pieces of work that looked at how well does this ecological integrity map align with what we know about species. And so again, out of the Coates lab here, really neat work that showed that, well, one, if we just look at core areas, that's where we have our highest densities of sage grouse, almost by double or triple compared to those other rangeland areas in the growth opportunity areas. And then they actually looked at population trends over time and found that when we've got those lowest SCI values, those are where populations are declining the most. As we move to these middle areas, there's smaller declines to start to stabilize. And in the highest SCI values, those areas that inform the core areas, we've actually got stable to growing populations of sage grouse. So a nice proof of concept that, yeah, this does work for sage grouse, even as we're transitioning to this biome-based approach. Similarly, for songbirds, this is some work that Alex Kumar did that said that if we just look at, again, BBS counts, we have upwards of 10, 6, or 3 times the amount of brewer sparrow, sage thrasher, sagebrush sparrow compared to other areas within there. So again, it seems to work for songbirds as well. One of the really neat things I think that came out of the special issue is that it broke down the threats, say invasive annual grasses, conifers, wildfire risk, cropland conversion, something we deal with more out here in Montana, and had step down tools to, at least at a biome level, help you identify where are priority areas across the range and where is important areas to invest. I think it's important to note that these large scale tools never supersede local scale knowledge and folks on the ground who understand their landscape, understand their threats, and understand their opportunities. But it's a way of sort of formalizing from a really large framework where to invest in landscapes. And again, I've got a link there. I can share it with folks if they're interested, but all these layers are available at the Grassland and Sagebrush Conservation Portal. Within an ArcGIS framework, you can zoom into your landscape, zoom out, overlay different layers. It's a really neat visualization tool that folks have put together. And I thought it was just worth pointing out that, like, again, just east of Horse Lake there, where Tiffany mentioned some work was going on, it's identified as an important area for prioritizing and managing conifers based off this work that Jason Reinhardt did. I'll breeze over that for now, and then lastly, the one thing I want to leave with is I think the sagebrush conservation design did a really good job of identifying threats and then understanding their contribution, those threats' contribution to loss of sagebrush ecological integrity. So we look at percent of SEI change in each driver accounts for it. So basically, like, how important is that threat to the overall sagebrush ecological integrity? I don't think it's surprising that annual grass there is hands down the #1, right? Interestingly, tree cover comes in at #2, followed by, again, loss of sagebrush, loss of perennial grass, and then much smaller human modification, which is a really important issue, but very local when you think about it from a biome-wide perspective. Now, what hearts me about this is if we look at tree cover, our second most important threat within the sagebrush biome, it's the one that we actually know we can do something about, right? At scale. And so going back to just the wildlife summaries, we've got a really broad body of evidence now from 10+ years of science saying that, yeah, we can tackle this threat if we're targeted and working in the right landscapes. We've got prioritization tools to help us at a biome-wide level. And of course, local working groups like this one to really take things on at a local scale. And now we also have technical guides too. So maybe folks have seen this reducing conifer encroachment in the Western rangelands, that just technical guide. And they also have a pocket guide that came out as well. This is targeted more in eastern ranges, but I think it translates well to the northern Great Basin as well. So I'm going to leave you with that because I think I'm right at 30 minutes here and open it up to any questions.
Just starting out with a comment here, Andrew put in the chat the link to the sage grouse moving around the recent Juniper cut that you referenced. It's just north of Fort Bidwell, so you can look at the
Oh, awesome. Thank you.
in the YouTube that I can share with folks too.
Appreciate that, Tiffany.
Yeah, thanks to Andrew.
I was wondering, this is Emily Ryan, I'm with the BLM here in Isabel. I was wondering your thoughts on sort of just killing the juniper versus like killing and removing them for benefits for sage grouse and other sagebrush obligate species, like if we're seeing declines or if there's any studies out there of population and animal health data related to, you know, the presence, is it really the presence of standing live trees that's having an impact? And perhaps the overall health of the obligate, meaning other vegetative obligate species, the brush, the grass, et cetera, like the health of those species, that's the decline in the health of those species tied to the presence of live juniper that's then having this trickle down effect on animal health and or presence. Or is it really the structures of the trees themselves that seems to be having an impact? So I think, you know, it's could be more efficient and or quick to just go out and kill a bunch of trees versus, you know, having to kill and remove the tree. So I'm just kind of curious your thoughts on that. Is it really presence of the structure, you know, related to the conversations around perches for predators and that sort of thing, or is perhaps there's something else going on that's leading to the decline of the obligate species?
Yeah, good question, Emily. And I would say that if we go back and look at these studies, there's been no sort of treatment category for standing dead versus removed. All of those studies, I can say with a high degree of certainty, had removed them. And I would suspect, so I'm moving into suspicion world now, I would suspect that it really is the structure of those that are influencing behavior and demography of birds. So again, like you mentioned, perches for corvids, raptors, just my body work on grassland and rangeland species tending to avoid any tall structures. I think that behavioral avoidance would still exist, even if the junipers were dead. But again, I don't know that we have that information to say, now here's what the specific management type means, or standing dead versus fully removed. But I would suspect that those standing dead, those negative consequences would still propagate to critters in those landscapes.
Thank you.
Yeah, I guess as a follow-up to that, Jason, do any of these studies get into treatment types, you know, like how they treated, in the previous talks, we talked a lot about mechanical versus burning and, you know, different ways to treat juniper, which is a question we're always kind of facing with as managers here. Is there, I know that, you know, working your intact sagebrush is always good and moving out, but is there any other discussion on treatment types and how that affects wildlife?
Yeah, that's another great question. And yeah, I think we're in that same boat where we don't know. I can thinking about back to those studies, and it's been a while since I read a few of them in detail, but we've got all of the above in terms of treatment type, and then what was done with the juniper afterwards. So, you know, I think that's an interesting area in terms of like moving into this efficiency standpoint. What's the best bang for a buck and how to treat these landscapes? We don't have that information in terms of wildlife response to the different treatment types, unfortunately.
Okay, thanks.
I have a quick comment on that, if that's okay, Tiffany.
Yeah, go for it.
It's Andrew. Thanks, Jason. I just say, so like this photo that Jason has up on his ending slide here, this is looking down into your country from Oregon, right? Kind of on the state line. And the projects that I'm familiar with that had really measured grouse responses. It was places like that where you have these big sagebrush flats with somewhat minimal trees, a lot of intact stuff there. Grouse are already using that stuff. That's like Twin Lakes there. You can kind of see the little green there. And so the projects that were done in Oregon and parts of Nevada and stuff and into your country that have had these grouse benefits have been places like that where that smattering of trees was removed to make it an even bigger, more open spot. And that was generally hand cutting, sort of light touch because there just wasn't that much biomass to remove. So that's just one example, but stuff I'm familiar with.
Yeah, so like phase 1 treatments. What am I talking about?
Yep.
And then do you know, this is something that came up in the first presentation, if they lopped everything below 4 feet? Like, so below the height of the sagebrush, and is that important?
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially total removal. So they're not leaving stumps as best they can with chainsaws. And some of those contractors are pretty dang good at that. So you still, like John was talking about, have whips that come up. But if it's a clean, good work, then yeah, they're cutting the whole tree. And a lot of those were waist high to begin with. And so they're just leaving them or chucking them or whatever. So pretty small trees.
So I guess going back to the slide you had on Horse Lake, do you mind going back to that really quick?
Is that the prioritization one or the
That's yeah, integrity. So there's something that comes up a lot, right? Is that we're kind of on the edge of the range, and like, so the maps never portray us very well in Northeast California. So yeah, I was kind of curious to see. So it's saying that, or can you describe more what the colors are meaning and what's going on? Like our ecological integrity is good or moderate, maybe because it's green, or
Yeah, so this is I'll do my best to like say what got baked into this cake, but the idea is Jason Reinhardt, who put this together, tried to sort of like account for all these different objectives and how they might end up in a single map. And you can see it down below there. He used this thing called multi-criteria decision analysis. Basically said that ultimately what we want to prioritize is sagebrush ecological integrity, so that SCI from that big map. And then step it down, we also want to avoid areas with high invasive annual grass because we don't want to exacerbate that problem. And we want to make sure that we're targeting that phase 1 early successional conifer. And then they also had this piece in there too from another study where they wanted to target connected landscapes. And so that's what kind of like sucks it into the middle of the range a little bit. But the idea there is then that you can prioritize from highest to lowest. And I think, the take home here is one, this is a decent tool for a really large scale to think about things, but then you can almost like reframe it at local scales too and see like within my area, what's higher and lower based off these objectives. These might not be your primary objectives when you're trying to prioritize conifer removal. And that's why I always am hesitant to maybe show this at a real local scale because folks know their landscape better and what they're trying to target. Andrew looking at that slide and saying, oh yeah, that's where I would go first. I think that sort of local information supersedes these tools. But the take home is that there's also some really important areas within this landscape, even though it's on the edge of the range and it's not going to have those high connectivity values that more central areas get, or the SEI values that are driven by, Wyoming big sagebrush country in Southwest Wyoming.
great, thanks. Do you have any other questions? You can also type into the chat, those in Zoom. Have something.
I had a question. One of your early slides kind of showed Juniper really taking off in like the year 2000, but that kind of goes against what we were learning earlier about it being more tied to like the fire regime. I was wondering if you thought that was like a delay in like the remote sensing data because it took a while for the tree to get picked up, or if you had another explanation for that.
I don't have an explanation, but I'm buying your suspicion there too, that it probably does take a while before trees reach a certain height before they're correctly identified under remote sensing products like RAP. So there could certainly be a delay to that. Or just like as they start to fill out and that cover starts to show up within those products as well. So, you know, like that. So that model is trained, even though it's remote sense based, it's trained from AIM and NRI on the ground data that's developed across these rangelands. So, you know, hopefully it is picking up accurately what's out there. And then, yeah, I suspect that could be maybe something that happens too, where you have a delay just based off the size and its ability to pick up that signature.
Any last questions? We're about out of time.
I guess I have one last curiosity, just in terms of overall expansion of like conifer expansion in general. If there are any thoughts on, you know, that being attributed to change in fire regime versus just overall climate change trends, and any correlation that might, you know, that maybe studies are picking up on related to that.
That's a great question and entirely out of my wheelhouse. So I might phone a friend here, Andrew. I think I can't remember if you were on that fire paper from the special issue, but I'm racking my brain here for a study that has tried to partition climate versus vegetative cover in terms of influence on fire, and I'm not coming up with it, but
Yeah, thanks for putting me on the spot, Jason. So my organization does some work on PJ related issues way out of this region, like in the Southwest too. And one thing I'll say is that this is very general. The relationship between pinyon juniper, or in this case, juniper extent and fire is strongest in kind of this part of the world, Northern Great Basin, that sort of thing. We get outside of this, if I'm talking about something in Northern Arizona or something, there's less evidence in terms of fire being a driver. I'm generalizing big time. So it depends on local sites and stuff. So, and there, the patterns we're seeing in expansion or contraction in some of those cases that Jason talked about locally seems to be more about climate, long-term weather patterns, drought, things like that. And so, but with Western juniper, my sense is it's a cleaner relationship with fire. I'm sure it's complex and there's multiple drivers at play, but that work that Rick Miller did, that John talked about, things like that, seems to be somewhat compelling there. So